Hey there, I'm Jess from Making Do Crew, and today we're going to learn how to crochet the easiest hat ever. And the reason we're calling it the easiest hat ever is because typically in a crochet hat pattern, you're going to need to do some increasing or decreasing, which, let's be honest, always involves quite a bit of counting to create this nice tapered shape at the top of the hat. But in this pattern, we're going to turn our work sideways like this and work our rows in this direction using two super basic crochet stitches in order to create this nice classic hat shape. And don't worry, all of these skills that I'm referencing here we're going to learn together in this video. If you like approachable modern crochet patterns and easy to follow video tutorials, make sure you subscribe below so we can do this together again soon. In this video, we're going to learn how to crochet a very easy trapezoid shape. Sew one simple seam to make it into a tube, cinch the top, and add an optional pom-pom. The best part about this technique is that it works for any size head. So the free pattern, which is linked below, includes 7 sizes. So that goes from little baby preemie all the way up to adult men. In that pattern, you'll also see my perfect hat formula, which gives you step-by-step instructions for making your hat more or less slouchy. And even if you're just getting into crochet, or maybe you're not much of a pattern reader, please trust me when I say you can totally make this hat. In the printable ad-free PDF, I put together a chart that shows you exactly how many stitches you need to work for each part of the hat for any size. So this is sort of like a Cliff Notes version of the pattern. And once you combine that with this video tutorial, you'll have no trouble understanding how to make this hat in any size, even if you're not a pattern reader. So for this hat, we're going to be using Lion Brand's Color Made Easy yarn, and this is a category 5 chunky weight yarn. I really love the colors that it comes in, and you can get 2 to 3 hats depending on the size that you're making out of each of these balls of yarn. So it's a great choice for if you're making these for gifts maybe, or if you're working a craft market and you need to make a lot of them. And then the pattern calls for a 6.5mm crochet hook, which is a size K. But of course you can always change the hook size that you personally use depending on how your gauge swatch works out. And if you've never worked a gauge swatch, that's totally fine too. Just head to the written pattern because there's step-by-step instructions on how to make that swatch. I'm not going to explain it here because I'll just tell you how to make the hat, and you can use those exact same skills to make the gauge swatch. And then you're going to need a tapestry needle as well as a pom-pom if you'd like to add one to the top of your hat. You can also make a yarn pom-pom, of course, by using a pom-pom maker or a piece of cardboard. Okay, let's dive into the pattern. To get started with a hat of any size, we need to start with a slip knot, and I'm going to leave a pretty big tail right here at the end, just in case I need it for seaming. So I'm just going to let that hang off. And then my favorite way to make a slip knot is just to loop the yarn around my fingers like this, and then put 2 fingers from the other hand through and pull the loop through like this. So that creates a knot that's flexible, and we can move it and tighten it down so that it's about this size to place our hook through it. So once my loop is on the hook, I need to chain a certain number of stitches, and that number of stitches is based on the measurement from sort of like right below your earlobe to the crown of your head. So in this case, I'm going to be making a baby hat, and I'm going to chain 21. So that is just pulling the yarn through the loop on my hook. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm trying to keep the stitches fairly even here so they're all about the same size. Not too tight and not too loose, and this gets a lot easier with practice. It just becomes pretty rhythmic, and you could chain the day away. Once we know that we've chained the correct number of stitches, we're going to skip the first one here and work into the second chain from the hook with a slip stitch. And the number of slip stitches you're going to work is based on the size that you're making again. So if you're making a preemie size for a baby, you'll want to slip stitch 3 stitches. If you're making a baby size, I suggest slip stitching 4. And if you're making a hat for an adult, then I would slip stitch the next 5 stitches. So because this is a baby hat, I'm going to skip this first stitch here and then slip stitch 1. So that's just, instead of pulling my yarn through, yarning over and pulling through, I'm just pulling the loop on my hook through the second loop on my hook. So that's 1 slip stitch. Then I insert my hook again, grab the yarn, I have 2 loops on my hook, and pull through. So that's 2 slip stitches, pull the yarn, and go through that second loop on my hook, and then I'm going to insert my hook in the next stitch, pull up a loop, and then pull the first loop through the second loop. So now what we've created is 4 slip stitches here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Even though this one is hard to see, we're going to be able to work into it on our way back the other direction. So from here we can work single crochet stitches in each of the next chains. So that looks like inserting our hook, pulling a loop up, and then we're going to yarn over and then pull through both loops on the hook. So this stitch is a little bit higher than this stitch, and that's what's going to create, this is going to be at the top crown of the head, and that's going to be a little bit more condensed, and then this is going to be a little wider for the rest of the hat. So I'm going to insert my hook, grab the yarn, pull it up to have 2 loops on my hook, yarn over and pull through both loops. Let's try that one more time. Insert my hook, grab a loop, pull it up, yarn over and pull through both loops on my hook. So we've completed the slip stitches down here, and now we're going to single crochet in each of our chains all the way to the end of the row. As I approach my last chain here, that's this last little hole right here, I'm going to work 1 more single crochet, and that's my last stitch. And now I'm going to chain 1 stitch and turn this around. So now we're going to work back in the other direction. This chain is what's elevating our yarn to be ready for the next row. And the next row, we're going to begin with single crochets now, because we're always going to single crochet in the single crochets and slip stitch in the slip stitches. So in the single crochets here, we're going to work into only the back loop. And the back loop is the one that is always away from me. So right now, that's this loop right here, this loop, but when I turn around and work the other direction, it's still also going to be the one that's away from me. So it alternates on each row, and that's what creates that nice ribbed texture. So what that looks like is I'm going to insert my hook under only the back loop, so it's only under 1 loop of yarn, grab a loop and pull it up, and then yarn over and pull through. So I've single crocheted, it's called single crochet through the back loop only. And I've pulled up a loop and pulled my yarn through. So I'm going to continue like that. The whole hat is worked in the back loop only of the single crochets and the slip stitches. So let's single crochet through the back loop only of each of our single crochet stitches, and then we'll talk about how to do something very similar with our slip stitches. And now that I've single crocheted through the back loop of all the single crochet stitches, I'm ready to slip stitch through the back loop of the slip stitches. So it can be kind of hard to see where the slip stitches are, especially on the second row right here, because it can look as if you should work into the front right here, but actually we want to rotate our piece here and work into the back loop in these stitches right here. So they all sort of look like similar V shapes, but we're working into the row that is kind of running along where we placed our single crochets. So if you follow from the single crochets this way, you can see these are the slip stitches that continue forward. So we're going to work through the back loop right here of our first slip stitch, and I'm just going to insert my hook and yarn over, and then instead of pulling my yarn through like I do with a single crochet, I'm just going to take this first loop, pull it through the second loop. So it's just like we did a slip stitch before. So that's one. Then I'm going to work in the next one with a slip stitch, and I have 2 more here because I'm working a child size hat. And then we want to make sure we pick up the last slip stitch here, which sometimes can be hard to see. It can tend to kind of get matted down and just look sort of like that. You could think that there's no stitch there, but if you pull this loop up, there is indeed 1 more slip stitch to work into. And if you're ever not sure if you've worked all the stitches, I suggest just counting your stitches and making sure that you have the number that you think you should have. And if you're following the written pattern, that should be 1 fewer than the number of chains you worked at the beginning, because we eliminated 1 chain for our turning chain when we began slip stitching. So if you started, say, with 25 chains, you should have 24 stitches, and the way you count those is just the little V's. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You count all the way down to the other end here, and you would have the last 2 stitches here. This little bump is the turning chain, and it's not a stitch itself. So these are the last 2. So you can always count your stitches. It won't be necessary though once you get the hang of seeing where that last slip stitch is. So from here, we know everything that we need to do to work this entire pattern. Let's review real quick though. We're going to chain 1, and whenever we're chaining to work our slip stitches first, so when we're at this edge of the hat, what will become the top of the hat, we want to work a pretty tight chain. So I'm just going to tighten it down like that. That's going to make this edge a little cleaner. So I'm going to turn my work, and now I'm going to slip stitch into the slip stitches from the previous row. So this is my turning chain right here that I just worked, that first little V. And so I'm going to insert my hook in the next stitch, that's the slip stitch, and then work a slip stitch there. I have 4 slip stitches here, so I'm going to slip stitch in the back loop of each of those slip stitches. So really the only counting that you'll do in this pattern as you get the hang of the number of stitches you have is just the number of slip stitches. So I find it's really easy to just count those out and make sure that I got them all, and then I know that I'm ready to move on to single crochet through the back loop only. So now I'm just going to single crochet through the back loop only in each of the stitches that is left to the end of the row. And as I finish up those single crochets here, I just wanted to show you once again where the last stitch is. I'm looking for this little V right here. So this bump is my turning chain. That's not a stitch I need to work into, but this last V I'm going to work under the back loop and work a single crochet. So now I'm ready to work 1 chain and turn the hat, and it doesn't need to be quite as tight as when you're working the slip stitches. So now we're going to begin with single crochets. So I'm just working a regular semi-tight chain here, and I'm going to single crochet through the back loop of each stitch until I get to the slip stitches. So like I mentioned before, the back loop is always the one that is facing away from me. No matter how I turn this hat back and forth, it's always the one that's further away. And now that I've completed the single crochet section, I'm ready to slip stitch through the back loop of my slip stitches. And the way that I know my single crochets are done, it can be kind of hard to see. So what I like to do is just count backwards from the end of the row, because I know how many slip stitches I need to work. So for you, that will be 4 or 5, possibly 6 if you want to really decrease at the top of your hat. But whatever you're working in each row, you'll just count and make sure that you only have those stitches left. So since I'm working 4, I would look at this and say I have 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches left. And that means that I've already worked all my single crochets, and all that's left is my 4 slip stitches. So then I'm going to work under the back loop of each of those. And as you're doing these slip stitches, it's important not to pull your yarn super tight. So I'm not working it really loose, but these need to stay loose enough, because if you yank them down really tightly, they're going to be impossible to work in on the next row. So just keep them fairly loose, and except for your turning chain right here, you'll make that fairly tight, and then you'll be able to still work into your slip stitches when you come back in the opposite direction. So we're just going to continue like that, alternating those 2 rows, slip stitching through the back loop of every slip stitch, and then single crocheting through the back loop of every single crochet, until you have the number of ribs that is listed in the written pattern for your size, or until your piece measures as it should for the size head that you're making it for. And once you've worked the correct number of rows for your size, your trapezoid should look something like this. So there's a note in the written pattern that the way that you can tell the right side, because they don't actually look really any different, it's just about where the chain is that you started. So if you lay this out with the chain strand, this tail, on the side of your non-dominant hand, so that's this one for me, then your right side should be showing. So here's the tail on my non-dominant hand. That leaves the right side here. And I can count my ribs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that, and make sure I have the correct number for my size. And then I'm ready to fasten off my yarn here, which simply means I'm just going to cut it, and I'm going to leave a long tail. Like I would suggest a couple of feet, 2 to 3 feet, and you can cut your yarn. And then once you do that, you're just going to pull the yarn through the loops that it's already hanging out in. So I go like this, and now I'm fastened off, and I'm going to use one of these tails, either this bottom one or this one, for seaming. Now for seaming, I still have the right side of my fabric facing up. So here is the tail from the beginning chain with my non-dominant hand over here. So I'm just rotating it like this because this is going to be the top of my hat. And now I need to actually flip this piece over because we're going to have this right side facing out while we're seaming. So I'm flipping it now to the wrong side. So this is going to be the inside of your hat. Now I'm going to fold it, and when I do that, I want to make sure that I have the very first row, these are my chain stitches here, underneath the last row. So this is my last row here, and I'm folding it, and it's going to be seamed something like that. So here's my last row on top of that first row of chain stitches, and we're actually going to be seaming so that those kind of overlap, and that's because these chains, if you work seaming into them, they can get stretched out and be a little bit more visible. So we're going to stack them on top like that. If you have stitch markers and you want to pin this together, that's great. It's also a pretty short seam, so if you don't have stitch markers, it's okay. You can just line it up and eyeball it. For seaming, I've threaded my tapestry needle with one of the yarn tails that's left over here at the bottom. It doesn't really matter which one you're using. So I have one on my needle here, and again, I'm putting that row 1 underneath my last row. And then we're going to work sort of a version of the mattress stitch here. So the way that that works is we're going to work underneath on one side. Now I'm going into the same side, working down, and then I'm going to work down into the stitch on the opposite side. So what we're doing as we seam is we're lining up each stitch on the last row and the first row. So I'm working under it like this. I'm going around the post of that stitch, and I can pull my needle through. And then I'm keeping this overlapped, and I'm working back between the stitches over here on the last row. Now as we do this, we just want to keep our stitches lined up, like I said, and then also keep this piece overlapping. So now that I'm between these two stitches, now I'm working around this post between the next two stitches, and then I'm going to work between the two stitches on the opposite side. And then I'll just pop my needle out like this, because I'm going around that post and it's pretty easy to do. Then I'm going between the stitches on the next side. Up, around, and then down on the opposite side and underneath that post. So you can see this is not a complicated thing to execute. It's just a little complicated to explain. So I'm between these stitches, I'm going over the top between the next two, and then I'm working between the two in the first row. So I can go underneath and out the other side between those two. And I'm just going to continue like this, making sure that I keep the stitches lined up and that my rows, the first and last row, are overhanging each other so that they there's no stretching or gap in that section of the seam. And if you can see here, what we're attempting to do is make this ridge about the same distance apart as this ridge right here. So we're just trying to sort of disguise the fact that the pattern has to be interrupted. So you can continue like this until you get to the slip stitch section of your stitches at the top of the hat. And then once you're at the slip stitches, you're just basically doing the same thing. You're working up, and you can just work under the topmost strand of yarn on either side. So I'm just going to work like that, across, and then up on the same side and across. That's like a legit mattress stitch. So once we've made it to that point, it's important to tie a couple of knots, because when we cinch this top closed, we don't want to sort of scrunch up the seam at the same time. So I don't know what these kind of knots are called. I think of them as sewing knots, but all you need to do is insert your needle and make a little loop of yarn like this, and then pass your needle back through it. So once you do that a few times, it should be fastened down pretty well, and then you're ready to cinch up the top. And to do that, we're just going to keep our same yarn attached here, and we're going to work around the top by picking up the turning chains of each of these rows of ribbing here. So each bump, each visual bump here, we're going to just work our yarn underneath that turning chain. So that means that I'm working under one strand and I'm just putting my needle through. I can do a few at a time and pull through like that. And I'm just working my way all the way around the hat till I get back to where I started. And then we'll gently give it a tug to close the top. All right, this is possibly my favorite part. It's kind of satisfying. So you're just going to pull. We don't need to yank super hard, but we're just going to pull until we get that top closed. And depending on the size you're making and the number of rows that you have, you might have to sort of resituate these bars around here just to get it as tight as possible. It might be the case that you also have a little bit of a space left right here, in which case you can just work your needle back and forth a couple times to sort of disguise that. And if you're going to put a pom-pom there, you won't ever see it. But if not, you can just work to close that up with a couple extra stitches. And then lastly, if you want to add a pom-pom to the top, it's definitely not mandatory, but it sure is cute. So I'm just going to keep my yarn attached like this, and then depending on the kind of pom-pom you have, it might have a little loop right here that you can work your needle through. I made this one, so I'm just going to poke my needle into it. And then once I've got that secured, I'm just going to do a few whip stitches into the hat and then back into the pom-pom and then back into the hat. I like to do that a few times just to make sure it's on there really securely. And then once my pom-pom is on there securely, I'm just going to thread my needle through that little hole at the top. And then I'm going to just keep the needle attached so that I can weave in my tail here and disguise it fully. So that's just done by going under several strands of yarn like this, making sure that it's not poking through to the right side of the fabric. And I'm just going to go back and forth like that a couple of times, maybe I would say actually 3 or 4 times. And then I'm going to turn the hat right side out. And you can just do the exact same thing with this tail, weave it inside the hat and then clip it off, and then your hat is officially complete. I really hope you learned something new from this tutorial, and if you did, I would love it if you gave it a thumbs up so I can keep creating more of these. And you can find lots more free crochet patterns and tutorials just like this on my site, which is makeanddocrew.com. Thanks so much for watching, and happy crocheting!